Chapter 25. Fresh Trials. The Atlantic sunrise was a beautiful sight to behold. The bright light of the new day sun behind the clouds caused the fringes to glow golden yellow and orange, with the faintest hint of pink on the horizon. The water below was almost as still as a mill pond, with just the smallest of ripples dancing across the surface. It was going to be another perfect day in paradise. James and Chris rose early. They wanted to make the most of the time they had on the island, and to find out more about those smugglers that had been causing Jack Whiting so much grief. They had not taken long to find out that the smugglers operated out of a warehouse near to the main city of San Pedro. On the surface, the warehouse appeared to be for cold storage, but that was just a front. The smuggling had grown significantly over a short space of time, and due to the proximity of the island to Mexico and the United States, it was perfectly positioned to act as a distribution centre for the Colombian cartel. To the average person, the security arrangements at the warehouse were nothing out of the ordinary. But to the trained eye, there was more to this building than merely storing meat and veg. The keycard points, electric fence, and thermal cameras, not to mention the low-key security patrols, did suggest that something far more valuable than meat was being stored in the warehouse complex. "Those roving patrols are going to cause a problem with gaining access," Chris said after surveying the complex. "Best bet to approach from the sea. We could get a small inflatable under those pontoons and climb up one of those ladders," James replied. "It's still going to be tricky. Some kind of distraction may be needed to keep the patrols occupied. And I know just the two gentlemen for the job," with the hint of a smile. "Yeah, but I think blowing things up is not an option. The last thing we want is for the local busies to turn up, especially as they tend to be accompanied by the military." "True. Besides, they're probably corrupt, and in the employ of the smugglers. You know what these islands are like." "Yeah, we'll have to use a bit more guile than that. Think it's time we made a move back to the hotel and have a chat with those two before they get ahead of themselves. They do get overexcited without the right supervision." Gaz had been busy with Ollie doing a bit of prep for what they assumed would be a full-on assault of the warehouse complex. They were slightly disappointed when they eventually found out from Chris and James what the plan was, when the two finally returned from their recce, although they did understand the reasoning behind it. It was late in the evening by the time they all left the hotel and journeyed down towards San Pedro. They'd left a small inflatable in a small creek inlet, about 3 miles to the north of the industrial area. It was pitch black as they cautiously piloted the small boat around the headland towards the bright lights of the city. The stretch of water in front of the warehouse was dark, and the lights from the neighbouring installations cast long patches of shadow on the water to the north of their final destination. Nearing the warehouse, they sneaked in, close to the sea defences. Anybody looking out to sea would not notice a small boat slip silently past, the height of the quay obscuring the view of anybody looking out from the shore across the water. "All good so far. Another 30 feet, and we'll be under the first section of the pier," James whispered to his companion. "Ready with the painter?" They quickly made the boat fast to one of the legs supporting the pier and stealthily slipped into the water to swim the last few feet to the ladder bolted to the wall of the quay. Originally it had been intended to be used by the maintenance crews to gain access to the underneath of the pier to carry out repairs. The two nimbly scrambled up the rungs onto the tarmac at the top. Crouching in the darkness, they waited for the moment when Gaz and Ollie would create a disturbance at the other end of the complex that should drag the guards away from their posts, leaving the waterfront unattended, enabling James and Chris to break into the warehouse. It was not long before the two, who had by this time become really intoxicated, began to make a fuss at the other end of the complex by trying to very unsubtly gain access via the main gates. James and Chris watched as the patrols moved off from their usual routes in the direction of the noise to investigate what the commotion was, providing them with the perfect opportunity to slip into the warehouse undetected. The keycard lock on the warehouse door was new, but not that sophisticated, and it did not take Chris long to rewire the device, effectively bypassing the lock and the alarm system that was linked to it. James felt the adrenaline start to course through his body as the excitement of the situation increased. Inside the warehouse they came across many large freezer units, like the kind you would expect to find in any cold storage facility. On a closer inspection of some of the units, it became apparent that not all of them were running. They may have been in need of repair, but because of the background information they had acquired, James suspected that this was not the reason for them to be turned off. The only way to know for sure was to take a look inside. "Just keep an eye on the door," Chris said, as he took out his lockpicks from one of his thigh pockets and began to manipulate the tumblers of the first unit's lock. After 30 or so seconds there was a soft click as the last tumbler released and the lock fell open. Chris carefully opened the door, ensuring that he moved it very slowly so that the door wouldn't squeal too much. Peering through the darkness of the unit, it was difficult on first inspection to make out what was inside, so he took out his phone from another pocket, swiping the screen to select the torch from the pop-up menu. The small, bright light chased the darkness as he panned it around the inside of the large metallic unit. By the light of the torch, several large packing crates were revealed to be stacked up across the middle of the unit, the majority of which appeared to be labelled up, ready for shipping to the USA. Chris found a crowbar amongst a few tools leaning up against the right-hand corner of the nearest unit's door. Just like Pandora, he couldn't resist the urge to peek inside one of those crates. It took a few careful placements of the crowbar before he managed to prise open the lid of the crate. As soon as he had removed the protective polystyrene sheets on the inside of the crate and saw the coffee grounds underneath, the alarm bells started ringing. He was therefore not surprised, after plunging his hands deep into the legal stimulant, that there were bags of cocaine hiding in the sea of coffee. This was an old smuggler's trick to conceal the smell of the cocaine from the sniffer dogs. Chris took a few photos of the Colombian Pure before meticulously closing the crate up, making sure that everything was replaced exactly where he had found it. Nothing could look out of place. One thing about drug dealers was they were all totally paranoid and would spot even the tiniest discrepancy. After closing the unit up, he continued checking a few more of the metallic units, most of which had contents of a similar nature. However, the final 2 units did not contain narcotics, but were bursting at the seams with genuine US caffeine-free military hardware. This was clearly how part of the smugglers' payments for the narcotics were being made. Taking a few photos of the hardware, he began to form a plan that would involve a bit of blackmail to free Mr. Whiting from the influence of the gang, rather than doing something more dramatic like blowing up the building and its contents, which would certainly send a clear message not to meddle in the affairs of the Aussie, but would more than likely have the potential to backfire with lethal retaliations from the smugglers. "Are we good to go?" James asked, interrupting Chris's train of thought as he returned from keeping watch on the main door. "Yeah, I think it would be best if we get out of here as quickly as possible. I'm sure we would not get a warm welcome if we were found in here. I still can't believe the firepower these guys have managed to get their hands on. There's stuff in those units that are still in stages of development, which I'm pretty sure the Pentagon would be interested in being returned," Chris replied as he relocked the last unit. "Give Gaz a ring and tell him to make a bit more noise. Those patrols will have returned to their post by now." The two burglars waited a few minutes before venturing back outside the warehouse. They could hear that one of the Carib security guards was involved in a heated argument with the drunken decoys. "Hey fellas, I don't want to hear it. We've told you once. Don't come back again. If you don't listen, then things are gonna get real ugly. If you think a hurricane is bad, then you'll be in for a nasty shock. Get your liming asses out of here," the guard was saying, in a tone that highlighted the fact that he was beginning to lose his temper with the two intoxicated youths. It did nevertheless give Chris and James the window they needed to scurry back to the rubber dinghy and quietly make their way back to the safety of the inlet. By the time the four of them had been reunited and returned to Las Terzas, the Atlantic horizon had begun to once again take on the orange glow from the new day sun. It was going to be just another perfect day in paradise. "I think a drink's in order after that ordeal. Where's the bloody waiter when you need one?" "Same old Chris. Any excuse for a drink. Sometimes I worry about you." "So does my liver, but unlike Mr. Bond, you only live once, so you may as well enjoy it while you can." The banter continued as they walked round to the front of the hotel to the outside bar. There was no point in going to bed now that the sun was almost past the horizon. Unlike previous occasions when the men had frequented the outside bar, they weren't intending to get hammered. This was more of a relaxing drink after a job well done, and also an opportunity for Chris and James to discuss exactly what their next steps would be. "I thought that last security guard was going to lose his rag and batter you round the head with that police baton," Gaz said as Ollie brought the drinks over to the table where the others had sat down. "He apparently didn't like the look of your face. Not surprising, really. Just look at the state of you," Ollie cuttingly replied. "Ha! Have you taken a look in the mirror lately? Think you need to go and have a word with yourself before starting along this tack." "Don't think you should have gone there, mate." "Remind me who it is that can't remember their port from starboard and crashed a rib into the Port Admiral's personal yacht in Southampton? As I recall, you were the one who was meant to be keeping watch." "True, but I wasn't the one at the helm, now was I?" Whilst Gaz and Ollie continued their usual high-spirited jesting, Chris and James settled down into a deep conversation regarding the best way to use the photos they had taken in the warehouse. They were both agreed on the fact that the photos should be delivered to the warehouse, but they could not agree on the manner in which they should be delivered. Taking a large gulp of his Sazerac, Chris began to say, "Using a courier or just the island's daily postal service would be the safest option. I understand where you're coming from, but would it be taken seriously? They may just think it is some kind of practical joke. Personally, I think I would be far more successful for us to deliver them. It would have the desired impact. Besides, I'm sure we can borrow a couple of Whiting's security personnel to back us up. They wouldn't have too much to do. They just have to look the part," James replied, pausing to catch his thoughts. "But of course, Whiting may not agree to that, and the four of us probably aren't enough if it did all kick off. Well, it's almost 8, Chris said as he glanced at his watch. Whiting should be around shortly. He may have a better suggestion. After all, he has had previous with these characters, so should have some insight into the best way to get this done. Jack Whiting had had a sleepless night, having been well aware of Chris and the others had been up to during the night. He'd tossed and turned as the worry that something may go terribly wrong would not let his mind switch off. Maybe he had asked too much of the former serviceman. He finally managed to drop off after he'd heard the familiar voices of the men as they returned from their exploits. Still, 3 hours' sleep was not a great deal to work with, but he supposed it could have been worse. Rising just after 8, he dressed as quickly as he could. He was anxious to find out all that they knew. He was hoping that he could now draw a line under his dealings with the smugglers and concentrate on running a profitable venture without the constant cloud of oppression hanging over him. Morning, gents. Hope you boys have had a bonza night without too much drama, the Aussie said as he approached their table. No trouble at all. It was surprisingly easy, all things considered, James replied as he stood to greet their host and new friend. That's a relief. I did have a few twitchy moments last night, I can tell you. Well, you may have a few more of those. We haven't quite finished yet, Chris said. But don't worry, it will be all sorted soon, he continued, trying to reassure Jack, as he had seen the happy smile drop from Jack's face at the indication of more twitchy moments to come. Chris carried on to explain the circumstances and that they hadn't managed to agree on the best course of action. Well, that's an easy one. Instead of sending it to them, get them to come to you. After giving the problem some careful thought, Jack replied in a more positive tone, now that he understood the minor dilemma. They do come here from time to time to play poker and attend VIP parties and fundraisers. So the simplest thing is to invite them to a party, and whilst they're at their ease, spring the trap. They won't expect that, as they would be out of their comfort zone. They will be in a corner where they'll have very few options but to comply, he finished, before waving the barman over and ordering breakfast for the group. I like it. It's just the kind of sneakiness that appeals to me. Trust the businessman to know how to manipulate the situation to his advantage, James said with a wry smile, knowing full well that if a party was involved, Chris would be in his element, not to mention Ollie and Gaz. It did not take long for Mr. Whiting to make the necessary arrangements to host a VIP fundraiser at Las Terzas for the following evening. In fact, he'd sorted most of the arrangements by the time Devon and Rachel had appeared from their rooms for a late brunch. Unlike Mr. Whiting, they were used to the guys taking on difficult scenarios, and although they were still apprehensive of the outcomes of these escapades, they no longer felt it necessary to worry all night about them, and therefore had not rushed out of bed the moment that the intrepid explorers had returned earlier that morning. On the evening of the party, the small jetty below the hotel was abuzz with activity. The waterfront staff were kept busy on their toes by the almost constant stream of private tenders that arrived to drop off some of the more prominent guests. And of course, they would end up working well into the night, as some people loved to arrive fashionably late. Things were more relaxed in the tropics, and it was quite common for many people to not even consider going out before midnight. After all, they knew that due to the midday sun's heat, they could catch up on a few hours' sleep the next afternoon. In true Carib style, the party centred around the outside bar and a large canopy that had been erected in part of the waterside gardens. A DJ booth had been placed on the terrace with speakers dotted around the bar and garden areas. The chilled evening beats floated from the hotel across the water that had been set ablaze by the deep orange glow of the setting sun. As the sun slunk away behind the horizon, giving way to the night, the chilled atmosphere began to change. The DJ's set moving from smooth rhythms to heavy Carib vibes. It was at this point that Rachel and Devon made their entrance to the party from the hotel. Chris's jaw almost dropped at the sight of the professor descending the small flight of steps down from the terrace to the bar. She appeared to glide across the floor as the hem of her stunning light blue ball gown brushed the floor. And he was certainly not the only one to take an interest in the entrance of the two elegant ladies. Nevertheless, it was the DJ's set climaxing in the track "Let Me See You Whine" that was the real showstopper. Even Gaz and Ollie, who considered themselves to be experts in the female sex, raised their eyebrows at the grinding and twerking skills that several stunning local girls were showing off. It was like something that would expect at Tobago's famous Sunday school, not at a VIP fundraiser at Las Terzas. Jack found James and Chris propping up the bar having a leisurely conversation about the last time they'd been to the tropics and how something had changed dramatically, especially the amount of industrialisation on the islands, and yet the laid-back approach to life still managed to endure. "Gents, it's time. My doorman has just informed me that they've arrived." The doorman had run down to Mr. Whiting's office the moment the two large blacked-out Hummers had pulled up on the tarmac at the front of the hotel. "Give them half an hour to settle in before we approach them," James replied, as he nodded in the direction of the so-called gangsters that were just walking onto the terrace from the main building. "No problem. I must just go and greet them. They will be expecting me to give them the full VIP treatment. May I suggest meeting them in the boardroom when you decide the time is right?" Jack added. "Possibly, although I'd prefer somewhere less businesslike. A more relaxed atmosphere would be less intimidating," Chris said before Jack left them to greet the wannabe VIPs. Mr. Whiting really wasn't looking forward to cozying up to the new arrivals. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he approached the group. He was well aware of what they were capable of, and it was the thought of this that still played heavily on his mind. Even though after tonight he may be free from their sphere of influence, he wasn't getting his hopes up. He had been burnt in the past, and therefore had always learnt not to count his chickens too early. "Hey Jack, how are you, man? Looks like it's gonna be a great party. Hope you're not spent too much on it, man. 'Cause you know you still gotta pay us," one of the largest men in the group said. He was known as D-Boy. Jack didn't actually know what his name really was. He was the head honcho, and as far as the smugglers were concerned, he was the man. "I don't think this is the time or the place for that sort of talk," Jack coldly replied. He had hoped to avoid any talk of money today. "Now, Jack, don't be like that, man. Don't make me angry. 'Tis a lovely party. Don't want to go spoiling it, nor do you, man? 'Cause you know what will happen if I get a steam on," D-Boy said, as he roughly put his hand around the back of Jack's neck, giving it a firm shake. To the casual observer, it appeared as just a friendly gesture of affection, but the pressure that D-Boy was applying to Jack's neck was far from friendly. "As I said, not now," Jack's defensive tone cut through the air like a knife as he shrugged off D-Boy's grasp from around his neck. Unfortunately, this approach had the effect of inflaming D-Boy. It was like dropping a spark into a keg of dry gunpowder. Not wanting to lose face in front of his entourage, D-Boy grabbed Jack by the throat and shoved him through an open door on the terrace into one of the small bars. "Everybody out, now," he shouted. The guests in the room didn't need to be told twice. They quickly gathered up their drinks and hastily left the building, not wanting to further enrage D-Boy. He was well known on the island for his short temper. "You really know how to play with fire, don't you, man?" D-Boy shouted at Jack, who was by now almost cowering in the back of the chair that D-Boy had thrown him into. Luckily for Jack, Chris and James had watched the events on the terrace unfold. "Looks like it won't be half an hour then. Shall we give the lad a hand?" Chris said. "Would be rude not to intervene, I suppose," James replied, as the pair left the outside bar and walked up to the terrace. Approaching the open bar door, the pair were blocked by two of D-Boy's henchmen. "This room is closed. Nothing to see here," one of the men said. James didn't take the slightest bit of notice. Before the man knew what had hit him, James had smashed the man with his right fist just below the ribs, causing the man to keel over, only for his chin to make heavy contact with James's rising knee. The man fell to the floor, unconscious. By which time Chris had already dealt with the other one in much the same manner. "Sorry to interrupt, but I think we can settle this," James said as he entered the room. "You ain't got no play here, man. This ain't the colonies, you know. I think you should leave before things get ugly." "I think we're fine, thanks," James replied defiantly, dropping a brown envelope at D-Boy's feet. "What's this?" D-Boy asked. "Paper don't scare me. You a lawyer or something?" "Let's call it insurance. And don't worry, we've kept the originals." James's stare didn't leave the man's gaze. This was the crunch moment. Who would break eye contact first? Slowly, D-Boy dropped his gaze, bent down to pick up the envelope, and flicked through its contents. "Don't look familiar to me, man. Think you have the wrong person." "Don't try to play the fool. You know exactly what it is, and where. I suggest you permanently sever contact with Mr. Whiting, or these will make their way across the border. I'm pretty sure the Pentagon or Langley will be very interested in you after that. Not to mention the DEA." James could see the cogs turning slowly in D-Boy's eyes. He was clearly trying to weigh up whether he could bluff his way out or not. It took a few moments before D-Boy responded. "Fine. Have it your way. But you're gonna be sleeping with one eye open from now, limey." "Don't worry. I always do. Pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen," James replied, as D-Boy pushed past him out of the room, collecting his two dazed colleagues as he left. "Well, Jack, I think it's time to enjoy this party," James said as Jack gingerly got to his feet, not quite being able to take in all that had just happened. "You heard the man," Jack shouted across to the DJ. The music had died down as the guests had taken an interest in what had been going on inside the small bar. As the fat beats started up again, all was soon forgotten. The guests quickly reverted back to enjoying the party atmosphere long into the early morning. A few days after the night of the party, Jack had finished making the final arrangements for the passage across the Atlantic to the UK. The Aurora quietly slipped her moorings and slowly began to cut through the crystal clear Caribbean water, gradually building up speed as she cruised out of the harbour towards the horizon. James watched the hotel disappear into the distance. The fair weather forecast to hold for the majority of the crossing, and yet what would be waiting for them when they finally arrived back on home shores had already begun to concern him. They had been away for far too long, with no clue as to what lay ahead.